The Mars retrograde and debilitated period in late 1977 and early 1978 brings us back to the thematic pattern of erratic conflicts that are difficult to predict and control. So this time was the unfolding of the initial stages of destabilization of the Shah regime in Iran, combined with the frantic efforts to control the massive demonstrations against the American influence in their country, which would eventually lead to the Iranian Revolution in early 1979. So the events took place in Iran, but the influence by America and the eventual effects upon America were very direct and important even up to today, 45 years later. The CIA now admits it orchestrated a coup of the democratically elected leader of Iran, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, in 1953. The leader they installed, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, became a friendly asset to the United States in the Middle East, first through the westernization of the country through its culture, also through ensuring safe oil shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf. The United States helped Iran by stamping out radical protest movements, and also the United States benefited through the lucrative arms sales being sold to Iran and the United States benefiting from those sales. And a staggering 1/3 of all oil revenue was spent on American contracts for weapons, something that very few Iranians believed that they actually needed. So while the United States didn't control the day-to-day operations of the Shah, Iran was considered an indispensable ally in the Middle East. So just one day before Mars would go retrograde, on December 10th and 11th, 1977, a massive peaceful demonstration took place on the streets of Tehran with somewhere between 500,000 and 4 million people. So the demonstrators' message was very clear, that the American-supported Shah monarchy must be removed, that their exiled leader, Ruhollah Khamenei, who would eventually become the Ayatollah or supreme leader, he must be allowed to be returned to Iran, and that an Islamic government must be established. While Mars was retrograde on the 7th of January, another demonstration was violently suppressed by the Shah's security forces using the weapons sold by the United States. After the 40-day mourning period of the deaths of the demonstrators was over, on the 18th of February, when Mars was within 3 degrees of the 8th cusp and within 1 degree of US natal Mercury, and the Mercury in the United States is the 7th house lord of foreign diplomacy, and Mercury is also the planet of commerce and communication, there were more demonstrations which took hold in cities throughout the country, which resulted in the destruction and burning of symbols of westernization of Iran, such as cinemas, bars, and some banks. So by early January 1978, the number of Americans in Iran dropped from 58,000 to 12,000. They were retreating back to the United States as attacks on foreigners started to spiral out of control. So these conflicts directed at the United States' influence caught both the Shah and President Jimmy Carter by surprise, and their reactions perfectly exemplifies Mars retrograde and debilitated characteristics. President Carter continued to support the Shah despite the suppression of the will of the Iranian people happening by the Shah, and he also ignored his own advocacy for human rights considerations in foreign policy, which is actually what gave the Iranian people a lot of courage. Look, the United States is saying we have to respect the human rights of people around the world, so they said, okay, respect our human rights and allow us to the self-determination of our own leader. Well, Jimmy Carter was caught in a bind there, and he was seen as very hypocritical for supporting a Shah and his repressive attempts to stop the will of the people from being heard. The writer Richard Cottam wrote in Foreign Policy magazine in 1978, he said, "The Shah reacted to diverse pressures, advice, and impulses, which created a deadly rhythm. Liberalizing concessions were succeeded by acts of brutal suppression, then dismissals of loyal, if blundering, civilian and security officers, followed by more liberalizing concessions. The Shah seemed variously weak, vicious, disloyal, and ultimately morally vulnerable." So you see the erratic nature of the Shah's responding to this. It's not a firm action. It's not a firm, Mars, succinct, and efficient way of handling a problem. He was essentially all over the place. So again, while these events did not take place in the United States, they were the events, and what the Iranian people were doing, it was a direct repudiation of the people against the appointed American leader and the US's enforcement of its own cultural values on Iran, which is called Westernization. It was by Carter and the Shah's own accounts that this brewing revolution was a surprise, and it threw them into a state of alarm and emergency, which is that trademark feeling of this transit. And of course, this was an unexpected turn of events, and the eighth house is unexpected events and changes. So this left the Americans and the foreign policy strategists in the State Department with very few options, because they were seeing their will be thwarted, and they really had no choice but to sit back, re-strategize, and eventually submit to the will of the Iranian people.